Call out to Jesus.
Let me pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity to meet and talk about making disciples and being disciples. And, this is going to be a fairly free-flowing discussion, and so I pray that you would help me to be sensitive to the issues that arise and to hear the questions that are being asked. And would you give us wisdom to answer those questions and to align our hearts with what you're doing in the world so that we might bear fruit that brings glory to you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. I do want to have a free-flowing conversation, but I need to give you a bit of a framework for our conversation. Okay, so that'll help us, because we said, let's talk about discipleship or disciple making. That's a very big topic. But we're going to go back to first principles. Where does the idea of making disciples come from? We all know it comes from Great Commission, Matthew 28, 18 to 20, right? And in that Great Commission, Jesus says to go into all the world and make disciples. Make disciples of all nations. And how do we make disciples of all nations? That's in the original Greek. If you look at Matthew 28, 18 to 20, the original Greek, that's the one command in the verse. It's an imperative. Actually, it's the second one. There's the word behold or look at the beginning of the sentence, but we'll ignore that for the moment. That's the command, to make disciples. The question is, how do we make disciples? And there's three participles in Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And in English, you can recognize a participle because it usually finishes with the letters ing. And so the first step, Jesus says, in making a disciple is baptizing. Now, so step number one is baptizing. Now, if we're going to baptize somebody, and I can say this in this church because it's, I do this in lots of different churches. Some of them are churches that baptize babies, and some of them are churches that baptize believers. You are a church that baptizes believers. So when does somebody get baptized then?
When they're a believer.
When they've become a believer, right? So what is it that we do to help someone get to the point where they're ready to be baptized?
Talk about them. No, I think we share with them what they believe.
Yeah, and what's the Christian jargon? I said this morning we don't use Christian jargon, but here we're using Christian jargon. What's the Christian jargon term that we use for explaining to somebody the message of the gospel so that they can come and put their trust in Jesus? Evangelism, yeah, very good. See, you know this stuff, right? So the goal of evangelism is to help someone understand the gospel enough for them to make a decision whether they want to follow Jesus and cross the line of faith or whether they are going to walk away, right? So, So the first step in making disciples is to baptize them, which means that we actually have to explain the gospel to people so that they can put their trust in Jesus. And once they've put their trust in Jesus, then we baptize them. What's the step before that, though? Now, this morning I said we don't want to Bible bash people. We want to share the gospel with people who are interested. So I actually think there's a step before this called pre-evangelism, where what we're trying to do is ask them, are you interested in finding out more about Jesus? Right? So I actually think it's really helpful if in our minds we separate out, I'm actually explaining the gospel to someone so that they can make a decision whether or not to follow Jesus, versus pre-evangelism, which is where we're engaging in an activity where we're trying to discern or stir up or surface someone whose heart's been prepared, ready to hear the gospel, right? So let me give you this sounds airy-fairy, so let me give you some concrete expressions or ideas here. So pre-evangelism could be a friendship, right? We're friends with someone. Just because we're friends with someone doesn't mean we're sharing the gospel with them, right? But as over the course of time, we may be having conversations and they may be talking about something and we go, are you interested in these spiritual things? Like, I've never actually explained the gospel to you. Are you actually interested in hearing it? And they might say, yes, I am, right? Which is great. Another classic thing, a sign out the front of church, right? There's a church I know, I'm friends with the pastor, and it's on the corner of two busy roads, and they've got this big church sign out the front. And it's like amazing. He said, every Sunday we have somebody walk into church who never goes to church, but they saw the sign and they just thought, oh, I want to go and check that out. Now, just because they've come to church doesn't mean they're ready to hear the gospel, but it does mean that they're interested, right? Doesn't mean that they're ready to follow Jesus immediately, but they're interested. So it can be, social media ads. It can be, social, like helping people physically, providing food parcels. All you're doing, my classic one was, I was talking with a pastor on a church, and he said, oh yeah, we do this great outreach. And I said, what is it? It's a Wednesday morning mothers play group. We have 30 mothers from the community who have nothing to do with church except for our Wednesday morning mothers play group. And so that's our outreach to the community. I said, that's great. So that could qualify for this, except I said, so how many of them ever get a chance to hear the gospel? He says, oh, we never do that in the Mother's Play group. I said, that's okay, that's appropriate. That's kind of where you're building your relationships. I said, do you ever, but if someone said they wanted to they wanted to learn what it meant to follow Jesus, what would you do? And it's like, oh, well, we'd invite them to church. I was like, is it Wednesday morning Mother's Play group going to a Sunday morning church service? That's a big step. Like, do you have something in between? He hadn't put anything in place in between. And I said, do you even ask them if they're interested in finding out more about Jesus? And he says, oh no, we never have that invitation. It's just supposed to be organically through friends. And I was like, do you ever have anyone come over? He's like, not really. I said, I don't think it qualifies as a pre-evangelism activity if you're never asking somebody, are they actually interested, right? So we can think about, I had a friend who organised a birthday party regularly, either him or his wife, they would be, and Bob was like, every birthday party we get someone up and they just share a simple story and we ask them if they're interested in finding out more, come and talk to us afterwards, And so it's just, how do we find opportunity, how do we create opportunities to ask people if they're interested in finding out more about Jesus? And then if they're interested, then we explain the gospel to them. And some people go, I explain the gospel to people, but no one becomes a Christian. I said, do you ever ask them if they want to become a Christian, or do you just tell them the gospel? So it's actually important to get to the point of asking them if they want to follow Jesus. So pre-evangelism, evangelism. The second command, or the second participle in the Great Commission, Jesus says, is teaching. But it's not just teaching, it's teaching to obey in the Great Commission. So the word teaching is the participle, teaching them to obey. And so then we want to think about this as well. It's like somebody becomes a Christian because they've heard the gospel, but then once they become a Christian, there's some things that they need to know in order to grow in their Christian faith, right? And so on campus, we would talk about things like, can you be sure that you're a Christian? How do you know that you're a Christian, right? Which, if you think about it, is really just the gospel applied to a Christian life. Confession of sin. What happens? I'm a Christian now. All my sins are forgiven, but I'm still sinning. What do I do? So, yes, Christians still, we confess our sin. But what does that mean? How do we do that? You might be thinking about some other things like being able to read the Bible for yourself. What's it mean to pray? You don't necessarily cover that when you're sharing the gospel with someone. It's like the basic spiritual disciplines. How do you go about practicing those? And so this is the first side, but then the other side of it, so this might be knowledge, and then this might be skills, right? So someone who's growing in their faith, who's got a personal relationship with Jesus and learning to obey him as an apprentice Christian, well, they're going to be joining with us, with the body of Christ, in the mission that God's given us to make disciples. And so they will need to learn, how do I engage people who are far from God? And if they're a brand new Christian, that may be actually easier for them than it is for us. How do I actually explain the gospel? I've heard it, I've learned it, I've responded to it myself, but perhaps I need some training to help me learn how to do that. And what if someone I'm meeting with becomes a Christian, what do I do to help them next, right? So there's some skills here that you may want to list out. And then the last step, I'm kind of rushing it because I want to get to the conversation, right? But the last step in the Great Commission is the word go. Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And so we end up with this baptize, teach to obey, and go. And some people ask me, if go is the last step of making disciples, why is it at the beginning of the Great Commission? And the answer, of course, is that the Great Commission is right at the end of Matthew's Gospel, right? It's the last verses. And Jesus has already done this with his own disciples, and the very disciples that he's done this with, he's now teaching them, he's commanding them to go. So what's the difference between someone who's an apprentice and learning skills versus someone who is gone or being sent? Jesus says in John's Gospel, just as the Father sent me, so I send you, is that this person knows how to do this person knows how to do this person knows how to do this, and they're able to take an apprentice. Right? So can you imagine if Joe comes up to you and says, I'd like you to disciple, we've got someone who's new at church, they're a new believer, I'd like you to disciple them. And you sit there and go, I've got no idea what to do right now. Who would feel like that? How many of you would have some sort of a clue? And how many of you would have a clear program in mind of, this is the Joe's shaking his head, waving his hand up here. So the goal, I think the goal for every ordinary Christian is to get to this point where they are able to be sent, right? Now, let me say the critique of most of our churches is that when it comes to the activity in our church, we spend a lot of time doing teaching, not so much teaching to obey, just teaching, right? Sunday morning is like good Bible study, good sermon on the Bible. Small group during the week is a Bible study. We meet up with someone, let's read the Bible together. It's like, there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just that it feels like an endless loop. And so why do people go, why should I keep going to church? Because all I get is more Bible and more, and get fed more as a Christian. Then if you get fed more and you don't do the exercise, what happens is you get fat, right? And my COVID experience over the last 2 years, I've put on about 10 kilos and I'm now in an office job and it's just killing me that people say, I should do more exercise. I'm like, yes, I should. Because if I don't exercise and I keep eating, then I'm just going to get fat. And as Christians, we end up fat and not in a good way, right? We get lazy. So, whiteboard eraser at the same time. It's okay. So what I want to have a conversation about is having spelled this out really quickly, right? And some of you will have seen me do this before, so that's why you're going to help everybody else. But what I want to do is have a bit of a conversation about what does this look like for us in this church, in this community, right? Because this model, baptizing, teaching to obey and going, is Jesus' generic command to all of his disciples. And I'll tell you that it looks different depending on which part of the world you are in and which timeline in history. So I can take you to the book of Acts and the church in Antioch, and I can tell you that the story is that Jesus' disciples scattered from Jerusalem up to the church in Antioch, and it says for the first time they established a church by talking with Gentiles about the gospel. And so they end up in Antioch. If you look it up, it's in Acts 11, verse 19. He says the disciples spread, and they spread the gospel, and they actually started to form a church around these mixed Jewish Gentile believers. And so they saw people cross the line to faith. And then the church in Jerusalem heard about what was happening, and so they sent Barnabas up to check it out. And in our world, if the heavies down in the headquarters go and send someone out to check out what's happening, it's very threatening, right? Except Barnabas, we know what's Barnabas' nickname? Son of Encouragement. So Barnabas turns up and he sees what's happening and says, and he encouraged them. He was excited by what was happening and he encouraged them, and he taught the word. And then he went off and he got the apostle Paul, who was still called Saul at that stage, and Saul and Barnabas taught in the church in Antioch for a period of time. And then after they'd sent some money down to Jerusalem and they came back up, and in Acts 13 it says the church was meeting together, the 5 leaders of the church, and they'd actually developed leaders in the church. There was a multicultural church at that point. I won't go into it, but multicultural church, and at that point they felt the conviction that we've got more leaders than we need at Antioch, we're going to send 2 of them, Paul and Barnabas, off, and Paul and Barnabas went off on their missionary journey. So let me tell you that this model of baptizing, teaching to obey and going is just the standard thing that Christians for all time in every place have tried to do. But every time and every place looks different, right? And so my argument this morning was Australian culture's changed, and so the way we operate is needing to change, and not that what we do changes in the big picture thing, but but what it actually looks like here. And your church, there's a few other churches here in Castle Hill that I know of, right? But you're a unique community that are uniquely gifted by God to reach people within this demographic somewhere, to make an impact, to make disciples. You're going to reach people that other churches here can't reach. So what I'm going to do is, if I draw this diagram this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What we have is over here is the community that we're trying to reach. They're the community that we're trying to make disciples of, right? Discipleship doesn't start when someone becomes a Christian. Discipleship starts when we first engage with them. And then over here is the send, and so this is what a mature Christian looks like. And our goal is to move people from knowing nothing about Jesus all the way through to being mature Christians. Right? That's the process of discipleship when you think about it. Right? Discipleship is not just how many Bible studies can you turn up to. So, so here's some questions. Oh, and so let me say at this. So here's the point of pre-evangelism, evangelism, what we call building, training, and sending. This end is determined more by your community that you're trying to reach. What you do here is more determined by the community you're trying to reach. What you do here is more determined by the type of Christians that you're trying to produce. So you better have an understanding of the community, and you better have an understanding of your final product if you're going to be able to work a disciple-making process. Any questions at this point? Yeah.
I have a small question.
Good, I've got a big answer.
If you think that you'll take up some of your time or not relevant, we can
that's fine.
We can discuss later on. I have a friend I know for 30 years or for more. I have another friend I know for 50 years. Another one I know for say about 10 to 15 years. I always want to reach out. They know I'm a Christian.
Yep.
One of them, I brought him and his wife to my previous church a few times. And after that, they say they're so boring. Now, I wanted to start a men's fellowship at my place at the start.
Yep.
But the one I know for 50 years is a very stubborn man. He's about, must be close to 50. He's about. And I think he's very smart. And he is quite smart.
Yep.
And we can argue until the last number refuse. So he refused to know more about Bible. His wife is a Christian now. The second one, I know him for 30 years. He's a very nice man. He's my engineer before we all migrated here. And he and his wife, that's why I took to church a few times. And they always say, oh, Mr. Lu, no, they don't. And I asked him to come to this church, he refused. The third one I know him for 10 over years. He's a nice man. I meet up with him for lunch very often. And told him that I want to start a men's school. And he looked at me, he didn't really shake his head very hard, but he saw not very cute. Now there's a...
Yep.
These are all my own friends.
You know...
To reach out to strangers sometimes can be easier than...
Absolutely.
Close friends.
Yes.
So what should I do?
So, great question.
I pray for them every day.
Yep.
because there are enough 2 or 3 men, they are very keen to join the group. They want me to start, but I haven't started.
Yep. So let's talk about the friendship one. Friendships. So friendship is different to doing ministry in a school or with youth or on campus or just random. Why? Because it is relationship over time, right? And just hearing your story and your heart for your friends, and my heart's breaking, And I wish there was something simple that we could do that was just like snap the fingers, right? And the real answer is, who turns hearts of stone into hearts of flesh? It's only the Spirit of God, and you're praying for your friends day after day after day, and you think about how much, I'm just feeling it right now, and I can't imagine how much you long to see your friends come into this life-changing relationship with Jesus. I think God's heart is also breaking, right? We're praying in line with what we were expecting and hoping and petitioning God to do. So we're praying, definitely, and it's really easy if you've got 3 names of people and you know what they're like, and you go, well, actually what I'd like to do is I'd like to run a men's group, a men's fellowship or something. It's like, but that's not actually what's going to appeal to them. So I would say prayer, because God's the only one who can change hearts of stone to hearts of flesh. But then you go, okay, what is it that is going to appeal to this guy? We like going out and having lunch. Your friend from the last 10 years. We have lunch together. You go, is there a way to change it from lunch with him and me to lunch with maybe one other Christian friend? Is there something, that it's not what we do, it's sort of how we do what we do. It's not what we do, it's how we do what we do. So if he's willing to have lunch with you, then maybe he's willing to have lunch with you and another friend, and just a normal lunch, right? Because studies have shown that it takes the average non-Christian to get to know 5 or 6 Christians before they kind of get a picture in their head of what it means to be a Christian. And very few Australians who are outside of church circles actually have 5 or 6 Christian friends. So one of our intentionally strategic steps is to actually introduce our non-Christian friends to our Christian friends. And the great news is that, like most Aussies that we meet who we're friends with, we're not friends with terrible people, drug dealers and, so on. Like most of the people we meet that we're friends with are nice people, right? They're nice people like our Christian friends are nice people. So let's just mix the 2 of them up. And because you imagine someone meets me, the guys in the dog park from this morning's message. They meet me and they go, oh man, I've got to be serious and intellectual if I'm going to be a Christian like Geoff, and I can't drink and smoke and I can't swear and I do all this stuff. And it's like, that's what it means to be a Christian. I'm like, well, actually, I know plenty of people who are, creative. I'm an accountant by background, right? The creative types. There are some really fun, creative Christians, You look around the room here, you're all different, right? What do we have in common? We have Jesus in common. And what's it mean to follow Jesus? It's kind of like the picture of all of us together is what it means to follow Jesus. Not just, you don't have to be like me, and praise God you're not. The world would be terrible if it was all me. Joe, you want to say something?
So, the building section, now you made the comment regarding how a lot of churches,
yep.
And I would class us in that to a certain degree as well, something we want to get out of, but we go around in a circle, we do all the feeding, we love people to get fat, and they get frustrated and found. How then do you move from that into discipling people into the mature section of the end?
Yep.
Go back to the pre-evangelism. What do you see in regards to how
So let me. So I really do want to get here.
Okay.
But let me start by this question. If I was to ask you as a group, so you said, okay, some of the people I'm trying to reach out to are these 3 friends. I know some churches where they go, I'm trying to reach all the people, like my Baptist church in Cherrybrook said, Cherrybrook itself is our community that we're trying to reach. right? So most of our church members live in Cherrybrook. We're going to try and reach Cherrybrook. There are some churches that define geographically. I know another church that's Filipino here in Blacktown, but it draws Filipino people from all over the place, right? And so it's actually relationally defined, culturally defined. So do you have an idea of who your target demographic is?
Yeah,
Joe?
That's a question I want to ask as well, because even in this community here, we have people from all over the place.
Yes. Geographically, you mean?
Yeah,
Yep.
We have people who come from the Mossman area, from all over the place and stuff like that. So in regards, we haven't actually sat down like that's what
Yeah. So I'm asking the question you guys haven't wrestled with yet, right? So from my experience of this church, there's a whole lot of ex-Borco High people, right? Borco High is this is the community that we reach that feeds into the church. Seriously, right? How wrong am I?
I think people come from all over because we've grown up in church. It started here, and then as we got old.
So what brought people in initially? So when the church was being planted, I can't remember the pastor's name. Yeah. So who's been here long enough to remember when he was pastor? Yeah, a lot of you, right? Because it's a very stable church and you've been here for a long time and you've hung out and you've built these great relationships, right? Is that the same demographic, the one that he was reaching out to plant the church? Is that the same demographic you've got now? Or you want to have now?
No. Pastor Ben, I remember talking with him, the initial thing was to reach out to international students.
Yep.
And things. That's what Pastor Ben shared. That's part of the reason why Pastor Ben has been very keen on the Chinese outreach in Rouse Hill.
Yep.
So that's what he had shared with me. It was that and then raising up the next generation of believers.
Yep.
What the initial thing was. The demographic has changed, I think, a little bit from there.
Yeah, so let me say, so like having a connection into the school is really strategic. Obviously, there's not too many neighbours around this church, right? They're all businesses, right? So how do you, so if you're thinking, I think you kind of go, okay, there's a reason why people travel here, but the further they travel, the less likely that the casual acquaintance they meet is going to come to church here. So you've got to think about, now if you're a Hillsong-sized church, right, people will travel a long way to go to Hillsong, or at least they would up until a few weeks ago. God protect us from messes like that. But there's a regional-sized church that attracts people from a region, but even as I said, there's like relationships, you know, that bind people together that will keep them from going, you know, from outside of a geographic suburb. I don't know that you want to define yourselves as a like we're reaching a particular suburb or a particular postcode.
We've done that. I guess, you know, people are saying we grew up being, you know, especially we're based in West Midlands at one point. It was just the local families that were there. So came from part of church. And could be a bit of a cultural thing as well, friends of friends. So
that's right.
Then we moved here, and, you know, as Joe was saying, people grow up, they move.
That's right.
We're coming back because families still here.
That's right.
And what's been interesting is that since we've been here, and we've gone online as well, that we've got people who come. You know, normally you like to bring friends, so someone knows someone.
Yes.
And we've had a lot of visitors who have just come because they've just seen our website. They're looking for a church in the area.
Yep.
Or whatever. Google that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Google us, and we're like the first thing, right?
Yes.
Come and check us out.
Yep.
And quite often you're like, oh, who bought you? And they're like, they don't know anybody.
Yes.
So I guess they seek to stay, and then, you know, and if we manage to get that engagement going on and build that friendship, yeah.
Yeah, so there's some geography to consider here, right? Now, obviously, Christians who live in the area who are prepared to travel from, you know, Norwest or Castle Hill or West Pennant Hills or something, that's still a big area. That's not just a local suburban church, like a local church parish, for example. You've got something unique about your characteristic, and I'm not here to tell you the answer, but I think you want to explore that a little bit. As a church, you want to think about what is it that binds us together, what defines us, and that if there's Christians who are coming to join us, what is it that's going to be attractive to them? You know, and you're a church that is contemporary in style. You're a church that takes God's word seriously. You're a church that's passionate about disciple making. There are lots of Christians who would find that appealing, right? There's lots of things you aren't as well. So you want to think about, your identity in that sense. But then who you are as a community is going to affect who you are going to, what people in the community you're going to reach, right? So you might attract, the single mother, down on a luck in Seven Hills or something, or a plumber or something. But that may or may not be your demographic. So who you reach determines what sort of activities you want to do, right? So my church in Cherrybrook, I turn up, and one of the guys there is wealthy and is a lawyer, and actually has a winery as a part of his investments. It's great. It's some sort of tax benefit, right? And so he hosted a wine tasting night for our church. Now, I grew up in a teetotaling church. The idea of having a wine tasting was just totally foreign, right? And there'd be some churches where a wine tasting thing is just normal, and other things would be like, oh mate, I'm more likely to test out the VBs than the wine, right? You got to check out who your demographic is, because what you're going to do is determined by your demographic. So on campus, we would have a new moon festival. We'd put on we get the moon cakes and pass them out when we're reaching international students. But for your average white Aussie guy, mooncakes is not attractive at all, right? I was like, I had my first mooncake, it was great. I love the experience, right? For me, it was cultural experience. I think, as I said, you need to think hard about, this is where disciple making requires hard thinking. And you need to think hard about who is it that we're trying to engage. And yes, a men's fellowship lunch with, or group with a few of guys who I'm already friends with. And in fact, what you're probably likely to do, given the nature of this church, is if you all sit down and list out, like, these are the top 3 or 5 people who aren't Christians that I think would have a chance of coming to church because they live geographically close enough. If you're working in the city and they're living in Nawi, and it's like they're unlikely to come to church here, right? So they may not be a work colleague even though you're spending lots of time with them at work. What you're looking for is people, let's define people and go, okay, they're going to be close enough to be able to commute to the church, and I've got to be in a regular enough contact with them to be able to have some opportunity to engage them in a pre-evangelistic thing, right? I can tell you there was a church up in north coast of New South Wales, and it was a very conservative, traditional church, but one of the guys in there had a real heart he'd moved to the next town about an hour away, and he had a real heart for his community. And so what this church did, and what he did, was he sat down and started writing down a list of the names of everyone that he met in the community. And as a church, every month they would get to, I can't remember if it was every month or every week, they would just get together and pray through all the names. There was like 30 or 40 names on this list, and he would update them on what was happening. The guy who ran the local IGA, whose marriage had busted up and was just in a real mess, became a believer. When the local IGA in a community like that becomes a believer, everybody knows it, stop being an alcoholic and everything, and suddenly they've got enough to start a church in this community because they were praying for each person by name. And then the mother church actually started doing the same thing. And they were in a much bigger town, but it's like, let's just list the names of all the people that we're engaging with. And if each person contributes 3 or 5 names, you can get a long list of people. If you've got, 15, 20, 30, 40 names on a list, and you're praying for them regularly, and you're being intentional about trying to think about how do I engage with them, then you actually see God work, right? If you're just praying for one person, if you've got your 3 names of people, and 30 years later, there's still nothing happening.
No, I didn't pray for them 30 years.
No, but...
I prayed for them the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I myself have become a Christian about 40 years ago because of men's fellowship group.
Yep. Okay, we'll come to that as well. Okay. Yep. Okay. Oh, that raises a really important issue. Okay. So what I'd say is, work out your demographic, right? And as a team, as a church, as a community who are being intentional about reaching out, don't pick, anonymous people. All the people who live in Cherrybrook is a terrible way of describing it, right? Because all the people you see in Cherrybrook, this is not a criticism, hello at home. This is not a criticism of my home church, but it's very easy when you go into the demographic, into the suburb, and you see people who look like you, right? And you think about reaching people who are like you, whereas actually what you're trying to do is think about what's going to work for them. The purpose of training people in how to do this is actually, the goal of training is to help people reflect on the experience that worked for them and think about how do we apply it to a different person, because not everybody's like me. So what worked for me, 40 years ago, may not work with the person that I'm talking to right now. Again, churches have changed, culture has changed, but the gospel hasn't changed. The gospel's impacted my life. It's made a difference to my life. I knew someone who was really deeply impacted by like a boys' brigade type activity, right? And forever they were loyal to running boys' brigade, even though the community had moved on and boys' brigade no longer had an appeal, right? Because their commitment was to running the program, not to reaching the people that the program had been reaching. So if you define your community well, and you might go, actually, we've got a lot of people who like mooncakes, or we've got a lot of people who want to go water skiing, or we've got a lot of people who, and it's like, well, if we do that, then we can invite them to an event where we just hang out and the gospel gets lived out, and we ask them explicitly, hey, if you're interested in finding out about Jesus, I can meet up with you and read the Bible one-on-one. Or I can meet up with you and we can do a Christianity Explained course. Or you can come and join an Alpha course, or the Introducing God, or Simply Christianity, whatever tool you use here to explain the gospel, right? So you've actually got to have a next step after the hey, come and hang out, or come and meet us, or come and be part of this, right? So often the Easter service, it's like, hey, we'll do a special outreach service on Good Friday, right? And let's invite all of our friends. And we'll put on a really fancy service, and people go, okay, it's Easter, I feel obligated to go to church. I'll come to church with you, right? And they have a great time, and then they go home and there's no next event, Oh, Christmas, let's put on an Easter egg hunt, and we'll put an Easter egg hunt on, we'll go to the local park, we'll gather all the families we're connected to. That's great, they turn up, but then it's like, we never ask them if they're interested in finding out more, and of course then there's the big summer break and everyone goes away for 2 weeks holiday, and by the time they come back they forgot they were interested anyway. So Christmas is actually a really bad time in Australia for doing an outreach. So you want to think about some of the things, depending on who you've got, what you're going to do to engage them, surface a spiritual interest, and if they say they're interested, work out what the next step is. Some churches go, oh, Alpha, we've heard it's great, we're going to run Alpha in our church. I'm like, do you know how much work it takes to run a proper Alpha with meals and videos set up? And it's like, and we've got 3 people who aren't Christians who might be interested in coming. Maybe you're better off just having 3 of your people in the church sit down and read the Bible with them, or do Christianity Explained or something. Like, less overhead. Be really specific and concrete to run your activities based on who you're engaging with. Right? So, as I said, these activities are determined by the community you're trying to reach. I'm pausing for comments. That was a really short question and a long answer.
We're really bad, we were just saying, like when you were describing earlier, I think we're really bad at getting from the friendship, the pre-evangelism state to the evangelism. Very bad.
Yeah, you're the only ones in all of Australia, don't worry.
Now we had a comment on, just like the leaders on this week, we fall into the trap of going to the world and make friends of all people, and disciples. And so we don't ever really get to.
So the comment for the videos at home is we're really terrible at moving from friendship actually to sharing the gospel. We make friends of the world rather than making disciples of the world.
Call out to Jesus.